It's a policy of the Council to invite all of Maryland's elected national representatives who have responsibilities or deep interest in the area of foreign affairs to address the Council. Our guest this evening is in his first term in the United States Congress, and he's taking foreign affairs seriously. This evening, while open to questions on all subjects, his formal comments will address the question of U.S. trade policy. He's a product of Baltimore City Schools, the University of Pittsburgh, and the University of Maryland Law School, where he graduated #1 in his class. Incidentally, he has been a member of the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs since 1980, one of our charter members, and a member of our Board of Trustees since 1983. Representative Cardin is known to all of you, especially because of his 20 years of service in the House of Delegates, the last 7 of which he served as Speaker of the House. His career there was distinguished and appreciated. Today, he's a junior member of the Congress. He serves as Vice Chairman of the Democratic class of 1986. He's Assistant Majority Whip. He serves on the Public Works and Transportation Committee and the Judiciary Committee. It's an enormous pleasure for me to introduce to you the representative of the 3rd District of Maryland to the United States Congress, the Honorable Benjamin Cardin.
Frank, thank you for that very kind introduction, and I want to congratulate you on the success of the Council from our first meeting. That deserves a round of applause. I was telling Frank that I've had the opportunity to talk with several people who have been your guests at the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs, and they're extremely impressed by the quality and the work that you're doing here. And I do congratulate you. And also, by the way, want to welcome you to the 3rd Congressional District. We're in the 3rd Congressional District here. If you go about 2 blocks north, you'll be in the 7th Congressional District in Congressman Mfume's district. We have 2 congressmen who represent parts of Baltimore City. I think I'm indeed fortunate to have as my seatmate a person who works very, very closely with me and with the people here in Baltimore to make sure that we have a united front in the Congress of the United States. I can tell you it's been a true pleasure to have a person of Congressman Mfume's talent and commitment and real desire to work hard and to work in unity for all the people of Baltimore City. And I'd like to recognize him. He's here tonight, Congressman Mfume, for the great help that he has been in the Congress of the United States. You know, I have been in Congress now for a little over a year. I served in the state legislature, as Frank has pointed out, for 20 years. I was Speaker of the legislature, and I'm also often asked, how is the transition from being the #1 person in the state legislature to one of 435 and a freshman member of that of the House of Representatives. And I just want you to know, particularly those of you who live in the 3rd Congressional District, that they're treating your congressman very well in the Congress of the United States. I have a very nice office in Washington on the 5th floor of the Cardin office building. For those of you who are familiar with the House office buildings in Washington, you know that not all the elevators go up to the 5th floor of the Cardin office building. But that's not all bad. Sometimes when you're trying to hide from constituents, it's particularly helpful to be on that particular floor. But no, things are going extremely well. I think I've made the transition very well, although I must tell you that my secretary, Linda Grani, I think many of you know Linda, many of you worked with me when I was Speaker in Annapolis. Linda's had a much more difficult time in the adjustment to Washington. In fact, George Gephardt, who's here tonight, a very important constituent of mine, one of my supporters and a person I really care for a great deal, really put us to the test. He wanted to come to Washington on the opening day of Congress last year and needed a parking place on Capitol Hill. Now, you know, to find parking on Capitol Hill is virtually impossible. To find parking on the first day of a new session of Congress is impossible. But George, a very important constituent and a person who at that time was the head of, I think, of his local PAC, so he was particularly concerned to me to make sure I could find a good parking place for George. I called in Linda My secretary from my days in Annapolis, who had been with me for 13 years, I said, Linda, we have to find a parking place for George. And within 5 minutes, Linda came back to me holding a parking sticker for the mall in front of the steps of the House of Representative Chambers, the best parking place in the city of Washington, better than my own personal parking place. And I said, Linda, how did you get me a parking place for the opening day of Congress? How did you able to do this? She said, no problems at all. I called the clerk's office, and I told the clerk the speaker needed a parking place, and we got it right away. So they're treating your congressman very well. I'm not sure that'll work ever again, but it really is nice, and it's a great honor to be a member of the Congress of the United States. It gives me a great deal of opportunities to deal with issues that are extremely important to the people of this district. And one of those issues that I have put a great deal of attention to has been the matter of trade. I think it's obvious, representing the 3rd Congressional District of Maryland, that trade is a very important subject. Look at the Port of Baltimore. Look around you. The Port of Baltimore is absolutely vital to the economy of the state of Maryland. It's estimated that somewhere around 10% of the economy of this state is based upon the activities that take place in the Port of Baltimore. A 1980 survey showed that 79,000 jobs were directly related to the Port of Baltimore. Obviously, trade is essential to the economy of the district that I represent, and I must spend and should spend and want to spend a great deal of my attention and priority to that particular issue. The recent survey showed that if you look at the manufacturing jobs in the state of Maryland, and there's a lot of talk about how much longer we can continue manufacturing here in Baltimore, Maryland, and the nation, but there are 209,000 Marylanders who depend upon employment in the manufacturing industries. And obviously that should be of concern to me as a federal representative as to where we are going in this nation in regards to our manufacturing capacity. So trade was just a natural for me to be interested in. And I took it upon myself to head up the freshman members of Congress in our effort to try to understand the trade issue. I chaired the group of the freshman members looking at the trade issue to give it a second look. After all, the 99th Congress had passed a major trade bill. It was criticized as being protectionist. I was not part of the 99th Congress. My colleagues that were elected for the first time were not part of that Congress. And we wanted to take a fresh look at it. And we invited the Speaker, and we invited the Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and we invited others to work with us and to provide information to us. And we took a look and did give a new look to the trade issue as we started our work last year. Let me just share with you one of the statistics that had me a bit concerned. Just recently, I looked at what the weekly amount of shipping coming into the Port of Baltimore looked like as it relates to automobiles. On a given weekend, we had 10 ships that came to this port carrying auto cargo from Japan, 1 ship carrying auto cargo from Europe. The average length of time that ship was in the Baltimore Harbor, those ships were in the Baltimore Harbor, were 3 days. When those ships left, not a single American car were on those ships heading for a foreign port. Last year in the Port of Baltimore, we imported 441,000 autos came in through the port, foreign autos into the American economy. We exported less than 18,000 cars. But that is not the whole story. Look at the Port of Baltimore and its total business. 70% of the business that comes through the port is import business. Only 30% is export business. That's not very efficient. The Port of Baltimore is an example of what's happening in this nation. The trade figures in the United States have been well publicized, and I'm sure this group is very familiar, that in 1987 our trade deficit hit a record $171 billion deficit. It was just 1975, if you want to go back to the last year that we had a surplus in trade. But in 1981, our deficit was about $40 billion. It's grown from $40 billion in 81 to $171 billion in 1987. And even traditionally strong export areas, such as agriculture, high tech, financial services, have suffered dramatic declines in the international scene. Now, we used to say it was the value of the dollar, that the dollar was overvalued, and that was causing our trade problems. And yet the value of the dollar between June 1985 and September 1987 dropped by almost 40%, and yet the trade deficit continued to grow. And if you look at the value of the dollar versus the Japanese yen, it even dropped by more than that, about 50%, and about 40% the West German mark. The United States today is the world's largest debtor nation. We all know that. But just 1981, just a few years ago, we were the largest creditor nation in the world. A major shift in the strength of this country in the international marketplace. It's been estimated that in the past 6 years, we have exported 1.2 million jobs in this country to the foreign marketplace. So there's reason to be concerned. There's reason to be concerned. What should we be doing? Well, I submit to you that we should be looking at what we need to do domestically and internationally. We need to do both. We need to change the way we do business in this country, and we have to exercise greater changes in the international community. If you think we should only look at the domestic scene, that the problem is only domestic, then I'm here to tell you that that really labels all international actions as protectionist. If that's the way you feel, that all international action is a protectionist, you condemn the United States to a non-existent role in an ever-increasing competitive and complicated world. I don't think that's a privilege that we can endure in this nation. We have to be an active player in the world marketplace, and it's not protectionist to do that. In taking international action, though, let us remember what Dean Atkinson said while serving as a Deputy Secretary of State during the development of the Marshall Plan. He said, and I quote, "The important thing in thinking about international affairs is not to make moral judgments or apportion blame, but to understand the nature of the forces which are at work as the foundation for thinking about what, if anything, can be done." With that in mind, let me present for you 4 areas of suggestions, 4 matters that I think we should be looking at, 4 arenas that we need to take a look at for bringing about certain changes in the way that we do business and the trade policy of the United States has been formed. It involves both domestic and international action. Those 4 areas include changes in the U.S. foreign policy as it relates to the Soviet Union and our allies. Secondly, a more aggressive U.S. policy in removing foreign impediments to free trade. Third, a commitment to make this nation more competitive. And fourth, changes in the U.S. fiscal policies. Let me start first with the reevaluation of the U.S. foreign policy. In 1945, the U.S. held more than 1/2 of the productive capacity of the world. Today, that's dropped to less than 1/4 of the productive capacity in the world. In 1945, the United States made certain commitments. We made major international commitments as far as democracy and peace were concerned. In 1945 and the years following World War II, the United States formed an alliance in regards to NATO and the Western European alliance. We got involved in the Middle East, we got involved in the Far East, we got involved in Latin America. We really got involved in many parts of the world in order to strengthen democracies and to make the world safer. These commitments continue today. The NATO alliance alone has been estimated that 60% of our defense commitments is a commitment to the NATO alliance in Western Europe, that we are spending in U.S. taxpayer dollars about $40 billion of your taxes every year in order to live up to our commitments with the NATO alliance alone. In the Persian Gulf, we are now up to spending somewhere around $25 million a month in order to keep the shipping lanes free and open in the Persian Gulf. Prior to the recent hostilities, our commitment was at about a $2 million a month level. So we've escalated that by about $23 million a month as far as the U.S. taxpayer is concerned. When we look at the final results at how much of our economy has been taken for defense purposes as a percentage of our gross domestic product, the United States spends about 6.6% of its budget. As you know, Other nations, no other of our allies, spend that great amount of their resources on the defense of the world. Great Britain's at 4.9%, West Germany at 3%, and Japan at 1% of its gross domestic budget. While our relative economic strength in the world has declined by more than one-half since 1945, we have made no similar adjustment in our commitment to international obligations. Our economic and international positions are out of balance. Writers such as Paul Kennedy and Walter Mead have put forth the simple but increasingly clear thesis that the national strength is ultimately based on economic potency, and that powerful nations face the risks of accepting military and foreign commitments so large as to eventually undermine their economic base, a phenomenon that Kennedy called imperial overstretch. Well, if you take a look at this nation and where we lead the world in the international comparisons, you'll find that we're now #1 on military expenditures in the free world, certainly. You'll find that we're #1 in exporting military goods, but you can't find much more than military goods in which we rank #1. And we're #1 in the production of nuclear warheads. But it's tough to find any other area in which we lead the world, particularly the free world. Well, there's some good news in this area. The policy that we started after World War II has worked. We have strong democracies around the world today. And these democracies are not only strong in their commitment towards democracy, but in their economic strength. They can assume a larger burden in the defense of Western Europe or the Persian Gulf. They can do more. Persian Gulf is a good example. Of the oil that is exported from the Persian Gulf, only 6% ends up in the United States, whereas 55% will end up in Japan and 28% in Western Europe. It's hardly fair for our nation to assume the type of financial burden relative to Western Europe or Japan. I think it's time for us to take a look at the fair allocation of these burdens. Now, I must stop here because I don't want to give the wrong impression. The district, my own personal views are such that I believe that the United States has a major role to play in the free world. We are the leader of the free world, and we must exercise that right and that privilege and that burden that comes with being the strongest democracy in the free world. The United States foreign policy must be to help nations that believe in democracy and believe in the human rights for the people that live within their borders. And we must provide U.S. assistance to nations that need our assistance in order to be economically strong. And I don't want you to interpret from my remarks that I oppose that. But I just wish to emphasize that some of the nations that we're helping today are perhaps as strong as we are as far as their economic activities are concerned. And they certainly are showing little sympathy to the United States in areas that we could use a great deal more attention. The second bit of good news in the foreign policy issue, in my view, is that the Soviet Union has found themselves in a similar position to the United States. When you take a look at the amount of resources that the Soviets are using towards national defense and their world activities, again, these figures are hard to come by. But according to U.S. sources, the percentage of gross national product that they devote to defense is even larger than the United States, somewhere between 10 to 17% of their gross domestic product is allocated to defense-related issues. And the economy of the Soviet Union shows it. We all know that the economy is not working for many reasons. Their system does not lend itself to the type of progress that we can make. But also the percentage that they devote to defense has held down their nation. So I think we have excellent opportunities to negotiate significant agreements with the Soviets, not only the INF Treaty, but strategic arms agreements and conventional and long-range nuclear arms. I think we have the opportunity at this time in the history of this nation, in the history of the Soviet Union, to do something which is far more important than our world trade balance, to negotiate arms control agreements that make sense, that are verifiable. Always have to say the word verifiable, like our president. But then because I don't trust the Soviets, But I know that they have the similar motivation that we have today to try to reduce the amount of commitments that they need to make to the world that we live in as far as defense is concerned. That we can reverse in this nation the record that I am not proud of during the last 7 years, where the budget of this nation, the military budget, went up in absolute dollars by 40%, whereas the domestic budget declined by 20%. I don't think that's a proud record to show our children that in this peacetime we presented priorities to our people that reflect those types of figures. Well, whereas I think, as you can tell, that there should be a fair burden sharing among our allies, and we perhaps could reduce some of the overall expenditures that we're doing as far as nuclear buildup. Let me turn to another area, and that is removing foreign impediments to free trade. A second area where I think we can make significant progress in improving our trade posture and changing trade policy. There are many examples of trade impediments of our trading partners. And I have to be careful. I mention Japan frequently only because Japan happens to have the largest surplus, bilateral surplus with the United States, $60 billion a year. So I mention that country the most. But my examples that I give for Japan are true with just about every trading partner that we have. That there are gross examples of where they have put up impediments to trade. Japan, for example, will not buy U.S. satellites or supercomputers. One example that I'll always like to give is lawyers. I'm a lawyer by training, as you can tell. But it wasn't only recently that a law firm could affiliate with a law firm in Japan. And that was protectionist. That was not opening up their markets. Public works agreements. Since 1965, the United States firms have participated in zero amount of public works in the country of Japan. That's by design of their nation, not by free and open trade. The relative figure on the other side is that Japan does $2 billion a year in public works work in this country, zero on the other side of the ledger. That's a designed policy of their government to keep our people out. And I could give you examples in Korea. You know, Dick Gephardt uses the Chrysler K car example, that it cost $48,000 to buy that car in Korea. Now, I understand there's been some controversy on the ad that he ran. That's not true. I understand it might only be $29,000. Big deal. If it's anywhere close to what he says it is, either $29,000 or $48,000, there's something wrong and something that needs to be done in order to open up those marketplaces. Well, the focus of Congress is on the famous Gephardt Amendment. The famous Gephardt Amendment. There are those who say it's protectionism. And there are those who say that if we don't pass the Gephardt Amendment, there's no way that we can open up foreign marketplaces. And to both of those camps, I say you're wrong. The Gephardt Amendment is not protectionism. And the Gephardt Amendment will not open up the markets of the world to free trade. I think both sides have really focused on the wrong part, don't understand the politics of the Gephardt Amendment, and have misconstrued it. I think the Gephardt Amendment is very defensible. I don't know how you could argue against what it says. It says that if a nation has an excessive and unwarranted trade surplus with the United States, that the U.S. trade representative is required to negotiate with that nation to remove those unwarranted conditions. If there are established international rules that are being violated, our trade representative must move to remove those impediments. How can you argue against that? He has 6 months to negotiate an agreement. If he can't negotiate an agreement, there's automatic sanctions imposed, unless the President determines it's against the interest of the United States to impose those sanctions. How can you argue against that? Fully defensible. Let me just give you one example of how this type of policy would work. After all, the purpose here is to have a strong defense against protectionist policies by other countries, sort of similar to the philosophy of a strong defense to stop a war. I think most people here would agree that we need a strong defense in this country. We don't want to be vulnerable to an attack by an enemy. And the same thing holds true of trade policy. If we open up our borders and say, well, you can do whatever you want to in your country, then you may very well find yourself in a position of having the other country's boundaries not available for your trade. The Kansan Airport in Japan was an $8 billion, is an $8 billion public works contract. The United States firms asked to bid on that contract and were denied. That happened in November of 1987. The Congress of the United States, in the continuing resolution, contained a provision that said that if Japan did not open up its markets to the United States in public works, we would not permit any of our tax dollars to be used for Japan in doing public works contracts in the United States. A modified Gephardt approach. What happened? It passed. It was law. It was signed by the President. In January of 1988, Japan reversed itself and allowed U.S. entities to now negotiate and bid on that airport public works project. It's hard to argue against the logic of that type of philosophy, that if you believe in free trade, then you need a strong position in order to be able to defend it. If you believe against war, you need a strong posture to prevent war. That's the basic argument. So it's not protectionism. In my view, I really don't believe it is protectionism. But then I said I don't think it's really not a method to open up. Why do I say that? Why does it really not open up the trade posture? Well, the President has all these powers already. The President could impose these types of sanctions. This past year, well, in September of 1986, this nation entered into a bilateral agreement with Japan in regards to the semiconductors. I think most of you are familiar with that agreement. That agreement provided for ways of getting around the dumping that Japan was doing on the semiconductor industry, and with opening up and giving access to American companies to the semiconductor field. In April 1987, the President of the United States, by the way, for the very first time, exercised the power that he has and imposed retaliatory tariffs against Japan in the amount of $300 million because he found that Japan was violating the 1986 agreement. Well, what happened? Well, in June, shortly after the sanctions were suggested, the situation was corrected, the tariffs were lifted, and it's estimated that the United States, firms in the United States through 1991 will now do about $5 billion in semiconductor business as a result of that action taken by the President of the United States. Quite a success story. But I think in each of the examples that we raise here today, there's ample power within the current laws for the President to take action. The Gephardt Amendment was put on by Congress out of sheer frustration with the lack of action of this administration. And we should be talking about whether it's good policy for this nation as it relates to the power between Congress and the President to put the Gephardt Amendment on the trade bill, rather than whether it's protectionist or needed to open up trade. Because I think those arguments really are not correct. Now, I'm sure I will get some disagreement from the people that are here tonight. I've already gotten some disagreement walking up to the podium tonight, and maybe we'll have a chance during the question and answer format to talk more about that particular item. But it's certainly on the minds of many people, including most members of Congress. It's in the Omnibus Trade Bill. You all know the Omnibus Trade Bill. It's in conference right now. There are only 155 members of the House that serve on that conference committee and 45 members of the Senate, representing 21 committees of the Congress of the United States that are involved in the trade conference. The trade conference is trying to work out the differences contained in over 2,000 pages of congressional action. It's interesting to note that the House only needed 910 pages. The Senate, because it usually talks a little bit longer than the House, needed 1,031 pages to express their views. The schedule for consideration of the trade bill has us today, literally, talking about trade issues in conference, basically the non-controversial issues. Right after March the 8th, in case you all don't know what March the 8th is, it has some significance around the country, but right after March the 8th, they assume that they'll start talking about the more controversial sections contained in the trade law. And we hope that there will be action before the Easter break on the trade bill. I think a trade bill will pass Congress and be signed by the President this year. So what will be in it in regards to the Gephardt Amendment, I really don't know, and I think a lot depends on what happens in the elections. Let me turn to the third point, and that is to make our nation more competitive, to improve our export position. I think most of us would prefer that, looking at the 70-30 ratio that goes through the Port of Baltimore, we don't object much to the 70% as far as volume is concerned. We would like to have the same volume level on exports moving through the Port of Baltimore. We would like to improve the amount of exports that we make as a nation to other countries. Well, the trade bill, the omnibus trade bill, is really aimed at that. The Gephardt Amendment is one small, as far as number of pages, provision within the trade bill. The trade bill looks at trying to find ways to make our workforce more competitive, workers retraining and education. That's a whole section in the bill providing basic additional resources of this nation to retraining our workforce and basic education of our workforce. Export promotion is provided particularly for agriculture and small business concerns and products, spelled out very clearly in the bill, and additional resources given to those efforts. An industrial Competitiveness Council is established under the trade bill as another effort to try to put a focal point on what we should be doing as far as improving our exports. And also, we try to consolidate the executive agencies with more of a focal point on having a point person in the executive branch who can work on exports and try to improve our export posture. I think they're all good efforts, and they're really not as controversial as some of the other provisions. So I hope that one of the things that will come out of the trade bill is a real emphasis on the domestic issues in this country to try to make this country more competitive. The third of the points that I wish to bring up tonight. But I want to mention one particular bill that I have some special interest in, and that's the Steel Revitalization Act, Hr 2743. It's a bill that I filed, and it's one attempt at trying to work in a responsive way, in a responsible way, to do something about the problems that we have in one manufacturing industry in this country, in steel. It's my personal position that this nation must maintain a strong manufacturing base in order to remain competitive and support our standard of living. While it's true that many jobs in this country have shifted from agriculture and manufacturing to the service industries, it's also true that our economy depends upon its manufacturing base. In 1986, 21.9% of our gross national product was obtained through manufacturing. That's up 0.6 of a point from 1976. So we still depend in great measure on manufacturing in this country. Very important to our standard of living. There's no reason to believe that if we lose manufacturing that we'll be more competitive in the service areas. We have seen very recently that we're losing an awful lot of business in the service industries. In the third quarter of 1987, service industry became a net deficit to this country for the first time. So we don't even have a positive balance of trade in service-related industries. My steel bill looks at one industry, looks at the steel industry, and tries to do something about it by first understanding the problem within the steel industry. There are three basic problems of steel in the United States today on unfinished steel. First, we have an overcapacity problem. We have much more capacity than we could ever use. Secondly, we don't have the modernization, the capital put in to make the industry as efficient as it should be. And third, we have pension problems. We have a workforce which is small, and we have a lot of retirees, and those retirees have pension costs, and those pension costs were never really fully funded. So therefore, we have these three problems that are making the United States steel companies less than competitive as they should on the world marketplace. In order to solve this problem, or at least to alleviate the problem, the United States entered into the VRA program, the Voluntary Restraint Agreement program, whereby we entered into agreements with most of our trading partners to voluntarily restrict the amount of steel that they would import into the United States. Many countries have lived up to those agreements. Some countries have not, Japan being a prime example of one of the major countries that have not lived up to their voluntary restraint agreement with the United States. My bill would build upon that system by auctioning off the right to import steel to this country. So rather than the foreign entity making the initial profit from the VRA, from the restrictive amount of steel coming into this country, that that money would be made by the United States and put back into the steel industry. That money would be used principally for loans to steel companies that enter into agreements with the government to address all three of the problems that we believe have brought about the current situation. Now, many of us could argue that domestic steel manufacturers have made grave corporate mistakes in the past, and that's true. But steel is vital to this nation, and the steel industry is important to our economy. And I think it's time that we look forward as to what we can do in steel, rather than looking backwards and blaming people for where we are today. My suggestion has a way out. It's a 5-year program. It ends after 5 years. It provides a way in which steel companies, someone just said, I don't believe you. Well, I can tell you the VRA program will never expire, or a similar version of the VRA program will never expire. We will always have some crutch, some protectionist policy to stop steel from coming to the United States. My plan at least gives us a hope. The type of revenue that has been estimated that could be generated is as high as $2 billion. That's a lot of revenue. That could really help. Steel industry today has about $8 billion worth of debt. If we can generate $2 billion and put it into a strict government program that makes it clear it's going to expire after 5 years and phases it out over that 5-year basis, then I think we at least have a hope of saving our steel industry in this country without protectionist policies that cost us all. I think it's worth the try. I think it's better than the alternatives, and I think we have to do something to preserve steel in this country. Well, let me turn briefly to my fourth suggestion, and that is changes in the U.S. fiscal policies. Now, I must tell you, this could be a matter for an entire evening of discussion, and I'm only going to mention a few points, and I must just apologize. It's not this simplistic, but I at least want to touch on the issue tonight. And maybe we'll have a chance at a later time to talk about it more, or maybe tonight during the question and answer format you want to talk about it more. I want to just stress a few points in regards to our fiscal policy and what impact it's having on our international trade policies. The United States savings ratios are at an all-time low. Look again at some of the comparative figures. The percentage of household income in 1986 being saved in the United States, 4.5%. Compare that to Great Britain, 9.1%. West Germany, 12.1%. Japan, 17.4%. The next figure I want to give you is the net foreign investment in the United States versus the amount that we invest in other countries. The net foreign investment in the United States in 1986, we had foreigners holding $1.3 trillion in U.S. investments. U.S. people invested about $1.1 trillion abroad for a net deficit investment of about $200 billion. That's projected to be about $400 billion by 1988, the end of this year, and by 1993, $1 trillion net negative investment by Americans. Well, my objection is that I think that the tax bill that we enacted last year, 86, before I was a member of Congress, remember that tax simplification bill? I have to mention that because I'm trying to figure out my own taxes this year, and if that's tax simplification, I don't know if I want any further action by Congress in the area of taxes. That tax bill to me was a disaster as it relates to international trade and to our international trade policies. I think it helped wealthy Americans. I think it helped certain corporations as far as profits are concerned. I think it helped poor Americans, getting poor Americans off the tax roll. But I think it hurt the country. It hurt our nation. It made it more difficult to invest. It made it more restrictive to try to do something about more savings and more investment by corporations. The capital gains tax, I think, is a major mistake in this country and needs to be addressed if we're going to do something about being competitive in the world marketplace. We've used tunnel vision in our tax policy, and I'm not worried about being competitive in the international marketplace. Well, we no longer can afford that luxury. We now have to think internationally when we look at our tax structure. We haven't done that. So we've developed a policy that may be good for the individual, but very bad for the nation. And I think it's time for us to take a look at some major changes in that regard. Well, let me just end on an optimistic note. I always have to be careful as I talk about our nation. After all, we are living in the greatest democratic institution of power in the world. That's a fact. The United States is the greatest power, the greatest democracy in the world. I served in the greatest democratic institution in the world, the Congress of the United States. It's a great institution. Could be improved, but it's a great institution. The men and women that serve in the Congress are dedicated to preserving our system and strengthening our system. And we will succeed. We will succeed in addressing the international trade problems by forging new partnerships between our allies and new partnerships between the private sector and the government sector. We will do it. We'll do it by new policies and by the ingenuity of Americans that made this nation as great as it is. I'm confident of that. I'm confident as I look through this room and know the people that have worked on these issues that we have the talent in this nation to solve these problems. I wanted to mention these points tonight because I really wanted to at least get you thinking on a comprehensive solution, because I think sometimes we look for simplistic solutions to a very difficult problem. Thank you for inviting me here tonight, and I will now subject myself to your questions.
Yes, sir.
In the light of the Russians breaking out of the ABM treaty, the paper I shared with you, is it feasible to reduce defense spending?
You want to repeat questions?
The question was, in light of the Soviet Union's inclination to break out of the defense treaty, do you believe it's reasonable to cut defense spending?
Our source is the Washington Inquirer about the Soviet Union breaking out of the ABM treaty. I'm not so sure I'm ready to concede that the Soviet Union will break out of the ABM treaty. I know that there have been different interpretations of the ABM treaty, and the majority of members of Congress want a strict interpretation of the ABM treaty, particularly as it relates to Star Wars. I think it's important to point out that it's the United States, not the Soviet Union, that is moving much more aggressively as far as research in space and in trying to get a SDI-type system in place. And if there's any threat in the universe, it's the threat of what the United States will be doing in regards to escalating an arms race. I come from the philosophy that no one can win an arms race, but I come from the philosophy of having a strong defense in order to negotiate sensible treaties. I believe in verification, and I think that's the key. The INF treaty that the President negotiated is an example of the type of treaty that you can negotiate with the Soviet Union that puts a very high emphasis on verification. We're going to have Soviets in the United States looking over our shoulders, and Americans are going to be in the Soviet Union. That's what I want to see on all of our treaties. I don't trust the Soviet Union, but as I look at history, I don't necessarily trust the United States too. I want to be able to really bring down the arms race, and I'm for bilateral agreements with the Soviet Union, and I'm for verification on those agreements.
Yes, sir.
I wonder if you could comment on one point which you didn't mention, and that is, to what extent could this trade imbalance be explained in part by a lack of initiative or effort on the part of American companies to export? And here I wonder if you could comment on Maryland companies and companies even within your district.
Would you comment on the degree to which our troubles with respect to a trade imbalance have to do with a lack of initiative on the part of American companies? And would you identify American companies and companies in your district which might be involved in that? Perhaps you don't have to answer that in great detail.
A few years ago, in the state legislature, we looked at the international trade figures by Maryland corporations, Maryland companies. And we were appalled at how little business was going through Maryland companies. We thought with our location and with everything else that we would be extremely high as far as the number of export companies and businesses that were able to export. We think the major problem was not the federal government's difficulty, but the state government. We as a state were not doing enough in promoting exports. Now we set out to change that. We developed our Office of Foreign Trade, whatever it's called, but we developed an office at the state level, Department of Economic Development, whatever that department's now called. They keep on changing the names of the various state departments. But DEED, is that what it is now? That department has a international trade component which is available particularly to small businesses to help with the paperwork and government problems on dealing with the foreign markets. So I think we have, as a state, taken aggressive moves to correct our past mistakes. Quite frankly, I think companies didn't want to be involved in the hassle of foreign trade. They prefer to do their business here locally. It's a lot less risky. But in today's competitive world, we are one marketplace. We have to be involved in foreign competition. I think American companies are now much more aggressive than they've ever been in wanting to get involved in international trade. One of the main provisions of the trade bill is to adopt at the federal level some of the things that we're doing now at the state level, and that is to have a place at the federal government, at the Commerce, where a business can go to avoid a lot of the individual problems that you might have if you're going to be involved with doing business with Brazil or business with Taiwan or business with Ottawa.
Yes, ma'am.
You said that our allies spend respectively like 1%, 3%, 4.5% for defense. Why, I don't see why can't we put pressure on them to spend more? I mean, what holds us back?
The question is, what prevents the United States from putting greater pressure on our allies with respect to their defense spending?
The policy of this administration. That's a simple answer to it. Let me elaborate a little bit. And that's an oversimplification, obviously. That's one of my only biased statements for the night. I'm a Democrat. I have to make some political statements. This country decided in 1945 that we didn't want Germany to become a military power. We didn't want Japan to become a military power. It was for self-interest. We didn't want to have to fight another war with Germany. You can see that in 1945 we thought the Soviet Union were our friends. You see how that friendship developed. I think it was a good policy. I think it's still a good policy. And I'm not promoting a strong defense built up by Japan or West Germany. What I'm suggesting, and I think what is being looked upon now, is an effort to be made to get a fair sharing of the financial cost involved in the military presence around the world. And quite frankly, the President did negotiate some improvement in the Persian Gulf. There is now a sharing by our allies of some of the costs. So he has made efforts to bring that message across. I think we need to take a look at it in a more enlightened way. Now, I must tell you, if you look at the countries that make up the NATO alliance, you're going to find a different philosophy on defense of Western Europe than how we feel about the defense of Western Europe. Now, we can do an awful lot because we're paying the bills. If we start sharing those costs, we're going to also have to share the way in which we think is the appropriate way to defend the Western European alliance. So it's not a simple answer, and I do apologize for my flip reply. That's not fair to this administration, and it's been the policy of all the administrations ever since World War II. So I really want to apologize for that abrupt, partisan reaction.
Regarding your remark about the poor rate of savings in the United States compared to other nations, do you think it would be an appropriate policy by the government to gradually educate Americans to spend less and save more?
Do you think there should be a governmental educational program to encourage less spending and more saving?
Now, I think Americans are going to do what they perceive to be the best for them economically, and if they feel that saving is the best thing to do economically, they'll do it. I think our policies, our fiscal policies, the large budget deficit that we have in this country, I mean, that's another matter for some discussion, but the large budget deficit that we have in this country certainly does not lend itself for Americans to save. So I think we shouldn't lecture to the American public about patriotism and saving. I think we have to develop a fiscal policy that makes it more attractive to save in the country.
Yes, sir.
The Soviet bloc borrows approximately right now like $2 billion a month from the Western countries. Tom McMillan brought up an interesting fact last week. He said last year East Germany borrowed $500 million from Japanese. The next day they earmarked $20 million of it for Nicaragua into a Swiss account. So indirectly we are in a way subsidizing a lot of the so-called revolutions going on. do we have anything in our law that, A, can control any loans made by U.S. banks? I mean, it states a specific purpose which the money is going to be given to, or do we have anything that affect our allies in doing so, mostly the Japanese?
The observation was that money loaned by United States, Western Japanese banks can be used by Eastern Bloc countries for purposes which we might think are undesirable. Is there any way of controlling what U.S., Western European, or Japanese banks do with the money which they loan? That was clumsy. Can we control what others do who receive those particular loans?
I don't think we can. We have certain principles of freedom in this country, and particularly our economy trying to keep it as. I don't think we can. I don't think we can if we try to regulate that type of circumstance, I think it could become so involved that we might be causing more damage than solving a problem. So I'm not so sure we can. Now we have started in this country trying to understand what activities foreigners are doing in our own nation, which I think is a good idea to know who owns what in the United States. So we're trying to get a better understanding of the activities of foreigners in America. But to try to say what people can do in other countries, particularly if they're not directly American concerns, many of these are multinational concerns, I'm not so sure we could do that effectively.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned your steel bill, and as the 3rd District, and historically we know we have another quite important industry out there, which is shipbuilding. Doesn't the steel example lead into the problems that assistance for U.S. shipbuilding
Yes.
have reached?
I think the question is to comment about what might be done for the shipbuilding industry. Is that a...
Well, also the dangers of the steel approach to other industries, such as the shipbuilding.
Would your approach to rectifying the steel industry's problem complicate life for other industries?
We have a chance of saving steel in the United States. I mean, especially steel is doing fairly well. I'm talking about the heavy steel and the unfinished steel, semi-finished steel. We have a chance of saving steel in the United States. We don't have a chance of saving shipbuilding as we've known it in the United States. That's already been lost. We do have some shipbuilding in this country, very little in this region. And I don't think we will ever return to where we were. We've lost that capacity in this country. It's gone. The plants are closed down. They're no longer available to be modernized. There are now condominiums where they used to build ships in this country. I don't think that's going to change. So I don't think we can bring back shipbuilding to the United States. I don't want us talking 10 or 15 or 20 years from now about steel as we probably would be talking about shipbuilding today. I guess, shipbuilding is one of the industries that is highly government subsidized around the world. We don't have a free marketplace on shipbuilding. We know that on our shipping. We know that. And that's what I guess one of the main points that I was trying to indicate in my opening remarks. If we are going to be a player in the world marketplace, then we have to be willing to do things like a steel bill or to convene our economic pressure to bear on shipbuilding, but it's too late there. I think we need to be a player in the world marketplace and to understand the political realities, as Dean Atkinson said, to understand that, but to also understand that we can exercise a great deal of influence and to try to do that. There's no such thing as purity anymore.
Yes, sir.
Your discussion was fairly comprehensive, but I didn't hear any mention of our trade relationships with third world countries. Now, I know these countries are hugely in debt, but can we really solve our economic problems in the U.S. or any part of the world, really, unless in the long run we work out some kind of decent trade relationships with third world countries?
How important are the trade relations of the United States with third world countries in the long run?
I think that's an excellent point, and it is addressed in the Omnibus Trade Bill. There are provisions to try to spread the burden more through the international organizations on third world nation debt. So there are efforts made to try to spread the burden so the United States does not principally bear the full cost. I have a feeling, though, the third world nation debt is probably similar to the issue on the valuation of the dollar. Everybody thinks it's a major player in the problem. It does contribute to our difficulties, but it's not as devastating as once thought. It is an area, though, that needs attention. We have foreign policy considerations with third world nations that we want to continue. We want to make sure that we live up to our commitments to try to make these nations economically sufficient and adhere to the principles of democracy. So it's very much in our interest to make sure that we continue to have a major involvement in these third world nations in the way they manage their debt. But on the other hand, we should encourage more of the international monetary organizations to be involved in solving those problems, as the Omnibus Trade Bill does. Yes, sir.
In regard to the INF Treaty, a lot of the missiles that would be removed in this treaty, the Pershing IIs and others, are primarily aimed at the Warsaw Pact nations to try to prevent Europe being overrun by the communists. In addition to this, it's a known fact, information I've picked up being in the military, that the United States is woefully behind in conventional weapons. Now, the NATO countries are looking askance at us, feeling they're being abandoned as far as the defense of Europe goes. Should this bill be passed? And I wonder what your position is on this.
The question is whether the INF Treaty leaves NATO vulnerable to conventional weapons. What's your position?
Well, you know, our allies, our NATO allies, are very much in support of the INF Treaty. They support it. They feel it's in their interest for the ratification of that particular agreement with the Soviet Union. You're absolutely correct. They would like to see the strategic and conventional forces also addressed by treaty as soon as possible. They feel more vulnerable on conventional and strategic than they do on the intermediate. So I agree with you that if they were picking what would come first, they would have preferred to have conventional before intermediate nuclear. But the politics of the negotiations took INF first. I know from discussions that I personally had with the West Germans that they're very much interested in us moving forward with as many treaties as quickly as we possibly can. I think that's a point I'd like to underscore. Our Western European allies are very much, almost to a nation, fully supportive of going down the path of reducing nuclear capacity. They want to see more agreements, and they support the INF. They want verification, but they also want us now to move forward with conventional and with.
It was good to have you join the members of the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs for this evening's session. A transcript of the program is available at a cost of $5. The Council is a private, non-profit, non-position-taking organization dedicated to foreign affairs education. Membership is open to the public, to all citizens seriously interested in foreign affairs. For membership information, merely call the Council at 727-2150 or write to Suite 2155 at the World Trade Center.